Welcome to the video. Today I wanted to take a look at something that was mentioned in one of Datto's videos. The video was about combining weapons of light with either Shadowshot or Melting Point to maximize damage against a target. I will have a link to that video in the description below. In his video, he showed that Shadowshot and Melting Point do not stack. Shadowshot will in fact always override Melting Point, regardless of the order that these effects are applied. So why does Shadowshot override Melting Point? Well, I believe it has to do with the way debuffs are applied to enemies. Now, I do have two theories on how debuffs are applied to the enemies. The first is that debuffs are given priority values, and the second is that debuffs are stored in a list. In either case, the end result is only one debuff will be applied at a time. Going with the first theory, let's assume each debuff is given a priority. In this case, the data for the enemies will only store one debuff at a time. For example, let's say Melting Point has a priority value of 1, and let's say Shadowshot has a priority of 2. So if Melting Point is applied while no debuff is active, then Melting Point takes effect. Next, let's say Shadowshot is then used. Since Shadowshot has a higher priority, it will override Melting Point. However, if Shadowshot is used first, it takes effect, but if Melting Point is used after, because it has a lower priority, it does not override Shadowshot. Moving on to the second theory, which will be quite a bit more complicated to explain, let's assume debuffs are stored as a list in the enemy data. To visualize this, let's say the list no and no is stored in the enemy, the first no being Melting Point and the second being Shadowshot. So, when calculating damage to an enemy, the game checks each position in the list and applies the effect for it. For example, let's say Melting Point is active. The list will be yes, no. So when the enemy takes damage, the game will check position 0, which is yes, and it will apply Melting Point. But when it checks the next position, since it's no, Shadowshot will not be applied. However, let's say Shadowshot is active instead. In this case, the list will be no, yes. So, when the game checks for debuffs during damage calculation, it will check position 0, see it's no, Melting Point is not applied. And when it checks position 1, since it's yes, Shadowshot debuff is applied. So hopefully that makes sense so far. But what if both effects are active at the same time? In this case, the list will be yes, yes. So when damage is calculated, it checks position 0, sees a yes, so it applies Melting Point. Then checks position 1, which is also yes, and applies Shadowshot. So as you can see, Shadowshot will always be the last debuff applied, which will always override Melting Point. So hopefully this video made sense and is able to explain how these debuffs might be interacting. If you guys enjoyed this video, do make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.